Good evening, everyone. My name is Ware Harmon, and I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of our organization and our partners at the Elliott Bay Book Company, it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's live stream presentation by Steve Davis and Chelsea Clinton. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is grateful for the opportunity to invite Seattle audiences into present tense exchanges of issues, ideas, and creativity, even when we don't get to do it in person. Town Hall will continue to produce online content throughout this fall and into the new year, and as circumstances allow, to even host live streams from our building. Meanwhile, if like me, you just can't quite get enough time on Zoom or YouTube, know that many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form under the header Digital Media. But back to tonight's program. The event will likely run about 30 to 40 minutes, followed by Q&A. Steve and Chelsea will take your questions from the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. Please keep your questions concise, and we'll get to as many as possible. Also, know that you can view the event both here on Crowdcast or over on our YouTube page if you want to utilize that platform's closed captioning feature. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include Jane Fonda and Elizabeth Lesser on women's activism to bend the course of climate change, Roger L. Martin about overcoming America's obsession with economic efficiency, Charles Kupchan with Walter Russell Mead about the past and future of American isolationism, as well as Howard Gardner, David Eagleman, Marion Nessel, and half a dozen programs in the 2020 Earshot Jazz Festival offered live from our forum space. For more information about all of the above, visit townhallseattle.org. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our civics programs in particular are supported by the Real Networks Foundation, the True Brown Foundation, KUOW, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. But as most of you know by now, Town Hall is fundamentally a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members watching tonight. Newsflash, folks, this is an unprecedented time for nonprofits. If you're not yet a member and you support Town Hall's mission to make ideas and inspiration accessible to the whole community, we hope you'll consider joining us or making a donation through the button at the bottom of your screen. And to conclude the infomercial portion of this evening, it's not an easy time for booksellers either, as you might have imagined. And since we know you'll want to spend more time with Steve's book, I urge you to buy your own copy here, now, tonight through our local independent partners at Elliott Bay Books, using the, again, very conveniently positioned button at the bottom of your screen. All right, then. Steve Davis is a wearer of many, many hats consecutively, simultaneously. Presently Senior Strategic Advisor and Interim Director, China Country Office for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He is also a lecturer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and a Distinguished Fellow with the World Economic Forum. He serves as co-chair of the World Health Organization's Digital Health Technical Advisory Group. And still, many of you may know him as the former president and CEO of PATH, a global health innovation and delivery nonprofit headquartered right here in Seattle. From the realm of other former hats, Steve has also been Director of Social Innovation at McKinsey & Company and CEO of Corbis. Steve Davis also writes regularly and eloquently about the intersection of innovation, technology, and social impact. He used real-life examples from 40 years in the field of global activism to inform the book that's the subject of tonight's talk, showing us all how citizens have transmuted their outrage into positive change. Heaven knows I could use some of that inspiration right now. Chelsea Clinton doesn't need my introduction, to be sure, but that's never stopped me before. She's the vice chair of the Clinton Foundation, where she works alongside foundation leadership and partners to help create economic opportunity, improve public health, and inspire civic engagement and service across the United States and around the world. She also teaches at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. She's the author of several books for young readers, including the New York Times bestselling She Persisted, 13 American Women Who Changed the World, as well as Star Now, You Can Make a Difference, Don't Let Them Disappear, and It's Your World, Get Informed, Get Inspired, and Get Going. She's also the co-author of The Book of Gutsy Women and Grandma's Gardens with her mom, Hillary Clinton, both of which I should say are in my daughter's own book collections, and of Governing Global Health, Who Runs the World and Why, with Devi Sidrar. Steve Davis's book, Undercurrents, Channeling Outrage to Spark Practical Activism, is the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Chelsea Clinton and Steve Davis.
Ware, thank you so much for that incredibly generous introduction. We want to thank Town Hall for hosting us this evening. We also want to thank Elliott Bay Book Company for helping bring us all together in this virtual space. It is always such a pleasure to be with Steve, even just on a split screen. Steve is someone I've long admired, am proud to call a friend, and someone I've now known for quite a few years. We first met when we were both working in global health, although we both still are, when Steve was at PATH and I was engaged in work with the Clinton Health Access Initiative, CHI for short. We found we actually have quite a bit in common. Stanford, a real appreciation for the arts and kind of the belief that kind of the arts are critical for young people, and a profound interest in innovation and a deep, abiding kind of moral call toward optimism. So I just am so pleased to be in conversation with Steve tonight to talk about his wonderful new book, Undercurrents. And I certainly hope that you will use the question function. I will quite gleefully exploit kind of my platform as the moderator this evening to ask Steve a series of questions over the next 30 to 40 minutes, and then very much hope that you will direct the time before the hour is up. So please ask questions. I will check the question feature regularly so that kind of we can be mindful of your questions as they're coming in. So Steve, just thanks for inviting me to be here with you, and it's great to see you.
Well, thank you, Chelsea. It's really great to see you virtually, and happy your kids are in bed and we can have this conversation now. And thanks again to Town Hall and to Elliott Bay and to so many others who've supported us tonight and also on this long journey.
So since we're here to talk about your book, which I've had the pleasure of reading, but I know many people who are joining us probably haven't yet, could you just start with telling us why you decided to write this book, why now, and a little bit about what it's about?
Sure. Yeah. So increasingly in my work and travels over the last few years, I kept hearing from a wide range of people, and that's students, it's activists, it was interested citizens, just kind of how paralyzed and confused they've been about the world around us, often really filled with outrage, but not really knowing what to do with it. And this was often kind of from the impression that things were constantly just getting worse all the time. And yet, the realities are, and the data and evidence often shows it, that actually quite a few things are getting better in the world, or that there's some interesting and positive trends that should be providing some hope and optimism as well. And they hopefully will help us improve the world around us. So I thought it would be worth to take some time to reflect on those trends. And started writing about them. And I called the trends Undercurrents. And it's really, the book is really about how to think about those trends in a way that might help today's or tomorrow's activists get more engaged in what I call practical activism, which is sort of not necessarily spending your whole life or your time out in the street protesting or, devoting your whole life to a nonprofit, but actually doing the kind of little and quiet things that practical activists do in the world to make it a better place for all of us.
I want to talk about practical activism in a moment, but first I want to just kind of delve into Undercurrents a little bit more, because I love the name, and I think it is such a kind of powerful framing. Could you just talk a little bit more about kind of what you mean by undercurrents and maybe give an example?
Sure. Undercurrents for me, it came from sort of a water metaphor, obviously, sort of tied back to my background. I can share some from the book, but it is on a ranching community in Montana. But what I'm really talking about is these sort of not necessarily the big headline issues that are capturing all of our attention, whether it's election or climate change or educational disparities and things like that. It's more the stuff that's working kind of below the surface that are actually phenomenally powerful to change the world. So I list, and the book is structured around 5 particular ones that I focus on, and I dedicate a chapter each. And there are things like, the fact that actually the demographics of the world are changing, that more and more people are living better, longer, and have more resources than ever before. And that trend is powerfully continuing, despite, it's not everywhere, but it's in general happening. And how powerful that is in terms of helping support activism. Or, of course, the focus on digital transformation is a complicated story, which has its risks and its challenges, but is also an amazingly powerful trend that the world is adopting to that will empower activism and social change a lot.
And you also kind of in the book, talk about the currents in your own life, and maybe you could just share what kind of some of the big currents in your life have been and how those have kind of ebbed and flowed kind of in importance for you, just to kind of continue with the water metaphor, and kind of how you think that could be, maybe just a useful experience, especially for young people who might be listening to us, kind of how the currents in your life have shifted and kind of how they've influenced you and kind of what that has all meant over time.
Yeah, no, and that's kind of where I got sort of the thinking about this idea of currents is actually reflecting on my own experiences, and that when students, as was mentioned, I am a professor at Stanford, and when I teach, I'm often asked for career advice, and I always shake my head like, I'm not sure you really want to get career advice from me, because my career kind of looks like a pinball machine. But on the other hand, what I describe as these waves of things that have happened during my lifetime, which have been powerfully affected by, and I've jumped in and enjoyed those into those waves. So the first one, which is I talk a fair amount in the book about, but is as a gay man, since who came out in the late 70s. And to ride that wave of gay activism and gay, the incredible transformation of what's happened to gay and lesbian rights and families, et cetera, over the last 40 years. And I've been very active in that movement. And so that's been a, kind of this wave that shows up at different times in different ways. But and similarly, the three others that I often talk about, the other being I was an early China guy. I went to China right out of college, and I've continued to work in China. In fact, my current role has a very heavy China focus. And there again, who knew that the last 40 years would see such an amazing a journey to see China go from when I was first there, very, very poor, a very closed society to a global superpower. The third area was I was very fortunate to have been asked to jump in the middle of the what we at the time were calling the information superhighway. But Bill Gates asked me to come on board and help them build a company that in the internet space before we were even calling it the internet. And I've been very involved in technologies ever since, and that's been transformative. And then I've been also quite lucky in that I sort of rolled up my sleeves in the early 2000s and started getting quite involved in global health and development. And I think that's been, an amazing journey as the world has actually been investing more heavily, as you know, with all the work you do, that there's so many things going on to really push us toward a better world through the Sustainable Development Goals and others. So I feel like those four waves have been very powerful in my life. So a little bit of my thinking was, well, are there other ways out there that might offer opportunity for young people, my students, or readers to think about maybe they could catch one of those waves? And those are the five I feature in the book.
And you mentioned practical activism, and one of the things that we talk about in our family, that I talk about with my kids already, is that we are, of course, citizens when we go to vote on an election day, but we're actually citizens 365 days a year, every year. And I think, that's an especially important message for all of us, but particularly for kids and young people. And I know that you feel the same way, Steve. So could you maybe talk about kind of what practical activism means for you, and maybe share some of the examples you give in the book?
Sure. And honestly, before I jump into that answer, I mean, I was so delighted that when you, Chelsea, agreed to do this, because I look at you as the work that you've done and the writing you've done, and your own books are actually a lot about that same theme, right? That the kids and young girls in the She Persisted work, particularly, there's ways to engage in the world, sort of get up and do it. So my thinking was, so activism sort of sometimes has a scary tone to it. I've spent a lot of my life in the corporate sector, where corporate activism is, kind of people kind of concerned what that is, or they think about it in very, out there ways. And what I was trying to get at is actually there's a quieter and often less visible form of activism that all of us have the opportunity to engage in. Some of it is, I guess, a little bit that same thinking that, activism is sort of more than just voting once every 4 years, or it's more than, frankly, liking something on Facebook, which, I guess that's okay, but it doesn't actually do much. But actually, you can actually use your own voice and your own skills in your own community to help within the neighborhood, help in your community, engage in, an issue that you think is important with the skills that you have, even if you're an accountant, or you're just a volunteer, that you don't have to be a full-time, all over the top, celebrated philanthropist. I actually honestly have written on this about the idea of giving back, which has become sort of a popular topic, and that we all have to give back. And I've always felt, well, giving back has a very weird implication. It sounds like it's okay to take for a lot of your life until you become, able or wealthy or something, and then you give back. And I think that's totally the wrong message. I think we are kind of most great social movements have started with, folks sitting around their kitchen table, people that don't have wealth or don't have a lot of means, but have decided something is important to them. So I feel like that is an important message more and more as we look at a lot of, I'm delighted we have big philanthropists. I'm working for one right now, but I think we often remind ourselves that there's a lot more all of us can do. So I talk about some of these folks in the book, these practical activists, folks ranging from an incredible woman I got to know in France, who's a corporate in one of the largest insurance companies in the world. And she kind of got very concerned about biodiversity. So Celine Subran is her name. And she decided she would take that on within the corporate context and help their company become a leader in promoting issues around biodiversity. But that was all within the context of her own work. It wasn't needing to go out and decide to repivot her life. And all the way to, a friend who decided to use children's theater and bring more theater to juvenile justice centers to ensure that we can marry the arts with this enormous mass incarceration problem we're trying to solve. And I think, all those things are such powerful ideas.
Well, I think, Steve, part of what's so compelling is, helping people overcome what, I've often thought of as just a real failure of imagination, not of intent, but of an imagination, to really be able to kind of imagine and then architect how they might translate kind of what they're passionate about kind of into a way that is kind of sensible for them, but also sustainable for them. And so part of what I so appreciate about your book is the examples, exactly as you just highlighted, where people are kind of taking what they already know how to do, whether that's kind of the environment where they're working or kind of what kind of their profession is, and then kind of translating that in a really powerful sense kind of into the world they want to live in, whether that's a more sustainable world or a world in which we recognize the kind of dignity of every young person in the juvenile justice system. Although I should say parenthetically, I don't actually believe there should ever be anyone in the juvenile justice system, because I don't think we should be incarcerating children in our country. Steve, I'm just curious now that kind of the book is out, and also that you've clearly kind of been talking with your students at Stanford. What have some of the reader reactions been? How have your students reacted to the book? If you've had the chance to hear from them, would just love kind of anything you want to share on that topic.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's only been out for about a little bit of time, so I haven't gotten a huge amount of feedback. But some folks have seen early copies, and some of these topics I've been talking about for a while. So as it relates to some of my students, I think they these themes that I did actually teach some in my class this year were kind of they were a bit surprised. I think, so often, as even very socially motivated or motivated for social change students at a place like Stanford, they see it as a very kind of in a narrow terms that either you've got to go become work for a nonprofit, or you've got and sort of have a bias, I would say, against the public. Public service is a way to do that. Government is sort of seen in a startup innovation culture is not necessarily the most effective way to get things done. And so one of the themes in my book, and also one of the themes in my class, is that these kind of multi-sectoral public, private, social sector partnerships are really vital for big social change, and therefore we sort of need to bring more of all these groups to the table again and again. I mean, I honestly, Chelsea, first really learned a lot about that when I used to attend the Clinton Global Initiatives, and how they were so often really emphatic that you need this sort of tri-sector partnership. And I think that's the theme that my students most resonated, like this aha, like, oh my gosh, the role of government is so critical to scale up social change, or the private sector is a very important part of this equation. And I think that's been a very positive response to the book and the theme so far. And then, of course, I have my mom loved it, so that's good too.
I mean, that definitely matters. I mean, arguably,
she was nervous. I'm sure she's sitting here watching tonight, very nervous, but she's
Steve, what's your mom's name?
Martha in Montana.
Hi, Martha. Hi, Martha in Montana. You got to give a shout out to your mother, Steve.
Yeah, well, same to you. She's one of my heroes. So say hi to her.
Me too. Yeah, I'm unapologetically biased toward my parents. I do think, though, like what you were saying that I think is surprising to your students is something I've also found surprising to my students. When talking about kind of especially what's been really like powerfully effective in saving lives over the last couple of decades, really often have been these public-private kind of multi-sectoral partnerships, whether it's the Global Fund or Gavi, or kind of what we're seeing now with COVAX, kind of the effort to ensure kind of equitable vaccine distribution around the world, which the United States is not part of, but thankfully most of the world is. Do you think that kind of this is a moment, though, where we will start to be able to kind of think about problems and solutions differently, even beyond global health, because the COVID-19 pandemic has been so horrific and catastrophic as a health crisis in our country, but also kind of further exacerbating our underlying inequalities and inequities?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chelsea, as you know, because there's a lot of promise, honestly, that out of this absolute tragedy on global proportions. And of course, it's more than one tragedy. It's the health crisis and the economic crisis and the humanitarian crises that are following on the full, that maybe we can, understand what went wrong and figure out how to correct that better systemically going forward. And so, and I'm actually involved in some of those conversations, and quite hopeful that there's going to be some increased in opportunity for different kinds of collaboration. There are people, talking much more about, everything from stakeholder capitalism as a stronger idea to really thinking about the global health architecture and what's worked and what hasn't worked, as you're so familiar with. And I'm hoping that we can find some of those silver linings. I actually worry, though, that the effort to turn back on economies, which is a really important thing to do as well. And of course, I don't see them all as in conflict. You have to, you have to, the economy and health go together. They're not competing ideas, but we're going to see also some efforts to skip over best practices in that, whether it's labor regulations or environmental laws or things like that. And we're already seeing some evidence of that, not only in this country, but around the world. So I think we're going to have to sort of hold people accountable for trying to make these lessons stick. And I'm quite excited. I mean, I have to say, I think COVAX, I was one of the people at the sort of founding about CEPI, the group that's putting together the vaccine effort globally. And I was at that, initial meetings, setting those up. And I am quite excited to see how many countries have come on board, how fast we're moving on the vaccine. 2021 is going to be a heck of a year, though, because it's going to be a real test to all of our ingenuity and all of our innovation and all of our systems to see if we can, continue to get this pandemic under control, but also if we have a vaccine or multiple vaccines to make them accessible equitably as fast as we can. That's no easy task.
Well, and I think, Steve, as you kind of pointed out, and as I hope there's kind of more growing awareness of, what the scientists are doing is extraordinary. I mean, we've never marshaled this much kind of energy and effort and investment toward any challenge ever. And the science is racing ahead, but we also have to build kind of everything else that needs to happen to ensure kind of that the science of the vaccine actually translates into kind of effective large-scale vaccination.
Yeah.
So
that, and also we have to remember that, I'm spending a lot of my day jobs on this issue of both sort of the digital support for the response to COVID around the world, as well as, now with the more of a China hat, but on, helping support the vaccine development and distribution, which is super critical. But, I think we've also started getting a little bit that the vaccine is the magic bullet. And, there are many countries in the world that are coping very well right now with COVID and are kind of back to work and they don't have a vaccine either. So there are multiple tools to get to this besides just the vaccine.
Yes. Well, they also, have adequate testing and contact tracing and
had a national plan and leadership.
Have a national plan and don't balk at wearing masks and all sorts of kind of other just basic kind of public health measures. Just two things that you mentioned that I want to kind of probe into a little bit. One, kind of the digital side, and one kind of on China. But first, on the digital side, we are living in a world that is awash with kind of misinformation around the COVID vaccine before we even have a vaccine or vaccines, and around kind of health broadly. I mean, we see this kind of, in the painful data points of the Nature study looking at how much more rapidly misinformation spreads about the measles vaccine than kind of fact-based information spreads about the measles vaccine or the MMR. Kind of, we see it kind of in the studies around what travels on kind of WhatsApp, particularly in the developing world, not only about kind of vaccinations, but also about maternal and child health broadly. I know this is an area of great kind of not only interest, but kind of real experience for you, whether with your kind of Gates Foundation hat on or your work with the WHO, kind of the current work with the Trinity Challenge. Can you just talk a little bit about kind of where you think we are on kind of the fight against misinformation online and kind of what we need to do, especially kind of as we look toward 2021?
Yeah, it's sure. And, if I had the best answer, I probably would be, wouldn't be sitting here writing a book, but because it's a really complicated one. So first of all, I've written a couple articles and some editorials on how the COVID has sort of become a digital moment and transformative digital moment for society, and of course not to mitigate all the challenges that it's confronted, but just look at we're doing right here, but we've sort of really fast-tracked online education, digital meetings, the telehealth, telemedicine, particularly in the health space. And that's been amazingly exciting. It's also revealed a lot of incoherency in the model and in the, so we've got some real work to do to make that more coherent and figure out how to manage and regulate and put some policy parameters around it. But it's a pretty interesting and exciting time. The misinformation piece is probably the most, in some ways, troubling, because so much is less about the tool, and more about just what it's unleashed in terms of behavior. So you've got to look at it from both sides. I do see that commitments increasingly by social media platforms to start, trying to control it in different ways. Sadly, a lot of this has been too late and honestly, sort of the cat's out of the bag. But I do think that it's now become such a serious issue, and the threat of more and more regulation is going to force some of that behavior to change. Actually, in the book, I talk about in the chapter on digital transformation, I talk about a friend of mine who I got to know through a board we were both on, but she's an incredible journalist in the Philippines who's really done a lot to expose the negative and powerful ways that misinformation and social media has affected democracy in her country, and she would argue in ours and others. Maria Ressa is her name, and she's now been arrested by the Duterte administration. But she makes a great point that it's we cannot necessarily. She's actually one of the biggest fans of social media still, despite the fact that she's seen the destructive nature. But in a way, the way I sometimes equate it, it's like a blockbuster drug. It's like the biggest blockbuster we've ever seen in the history of medicine. Some of the ability for us to improve health with digital and data platforms, but we've got to come up with ways to mitigate the adverse effects of some, as we always do with drugs. So I don't think it's a binary, this is good or bad. I think net, we're going to see much more improvement in the world because of digital technologies and social media than we're going to see the negative. But there are, key areas where we're going to either have to regulate more, or we're going to have to, I think there's some education that will help as well, but really getting smarter and also some parental and citizen accountability over this stuff.
Yeah, I agree. Since you also mentioned China now a number of times, I'm curious how you think about how feasible practical activism is in China, or is kind of in countries that have not a free flow of information and don't have kind of democratic enfranchisement. I guess what I'm asking, like, universal kind of is your book or not? And also, what would you say to someone in China today who wants to get more engaged?
Yeah, so I, throughout the book, raise this question of sort of the bridge building, often behind the scenes role of practical activists, and frankly, the way that sometimes you need to find a middle ground in order to build those connections and partnerships in order to get stuff done. I start with stories even as an AIDS activist in the 80s when friends were dying and there were street protests and really awful stuff happening. But, finding my comfortable place was more behind the scenes, working on, okay, how do we find some compromises here to get legislation through, or policy or litigation put forward. And I talk about that actually has a global implication as well, that so in the work I've done in global health and development, people are often asking, well, how can you work in a country, and not just China, but a country like the DRC, where there's a very complicated, if not and generally corrupt government. There's many other places in the world that have authoritarian leadership, dictatorships, or otherwise. And I guess my line, in some ways, I think those places are the most important places to do practical activism, because people have to find a way, maybe within the guidelines of the government, if that's if that's necessary, but to keep nudging change. And I have had the privilege of working with activists in the DRC and in China and it probably wouldn't call themselves activists, but people that were actually doing day-to-day things to say, okay, I need to write a paper to sort of understand how this really should work. I need to sort of nudge my local official to think differently about that problem. I need to build an app that enables people to talk to each other more about this. I've watched that in some of the most repressive regimes in the world. And the thing I always would say to my teams is like, look, the kid that doesn't get a right to a fair and equitable life is the same kid in a democratic regime as it is an authoritarian regime. And these needs don't go away because we don't get to choose where those kids live in order to do our work. So we need to keep thinking about how we can use our sort of practical activist voice, some of our toolkit around engagement, to support communities and leaders in those communities, a number of whom I discuss and feature in the book, who actually have nudged their communities along in amazingly powerful ways.
So it sounds like while the kind of means and mechanisms may differ, you believe that it is possible kind of for any citizen anywhere to engage in practical activism.
I do. I'm a globalist at heart. I believe that we share a lot of amazing features as as humans, and that the opportunity to keep pushing us to a safer and better and healthier world. I'm completely optimistic that there's more, that's a growing opportunity. And I see, the generations that are much younger than me now, who are doing some amazing work, in whether I'm, in Kenya or in Thailand today or in China. It's quite powerful, and I just hope they just keep pushing hard.
So I want to move to now the questions that our audience has submitted, and please keep submitting questions. And we have 5 right now, and I'll be able to get to all of them. I'm not going to ask them though in the order because I think the one that was most recently submitted actually is a good kind of segue from what Steve and I have been talking about recently, which is from Angela. And she asked, Steve, you mentioned digital transformation as an undercurrent. How do we move toward digital humanity versus toxicity? The access to the internet has given citizens of the world a voice and has, on the other hand, accelerated misinformation, as we discussed, and racism. How do we think about online pro-social change for our community and our children?
Well, first, Angela, thank you for the question, because I do think that sort of those operative words is sort of proactive digital engagement is really the idea here. Is we've kind of went from sort of a funny history in the last 15 years where we were all so excited, and those of us that were part of it, particularly were this digital transformation and revolution was just the most amazing thing, and it has been incredible and powerful. But then it suddenly kind of the dark side showed up, and then we kind of immediately sort of changed the narrative to it's a pretty ugly and scary place, and there are reasons for thinking that, for sure. And I again, I try to make this case in the book that it's here to stay, and net it's going to be a more powerful positive trend than negative trend if we can keep our if we do things right. And so I think, part of it is almost getting out of the is it good or bad discussion and moving to the next phase of it is which pieces are working well and which aren't. And what's the value proposition behind it for the places that it is working well? And so I'm doing a lot, like with the WHO, et cetera, like how do we use and deploy more digital capabilities and data to make a huge difference? So then I think the power of the positive pieces of that will help us, spur more ideas. The other is I'm a big believer. I used to teach this when I was at a different school. I taught at a law school for a while, that there's a very clear set of examples where technology often solves a lot of the problems it creates. And we've seen that pattern in history over and over. And I think we're seeing some of that begin to happen in the digital arena, where we've now created interesting filters to ensure that what we were worried about copyright violation 10 years ago aren't really happening as much anymore, because we've actually filtered those out with some very cool technology. And now we're beginning to see, you know, abilities to shape and filter online. So I'm hoping that we see more of that happen. But I do think that I also think that there will be economic forces that force some of this to happen, where people are going to vote to or choose to, you know, step back from some of these platforms because they're so toxic. I've been seeing a lot of my friends step off social media because of its toxicity. And actually, I think that economic power may help us as well. So I'm not naive. I think this is going to be a hard one. But I do think that there's an opportunity for us between policy and regulation, education, using our pocketbooks, and honestly continuing to promote the best uses of technology, that we'll see a better future.
And Steve, I think actually the question that was submitted right before is a good kind of follow on to that, which is, how would you tie mental health with the act of being an engaged citizen? And I think, Steve, you know, this has kind of shades for kind of what that would mean if you're an engaged digital citizen online, kind of with the toxicity that you've discussed just now, as well as kind of thinking about kind of offline activism, kind of whether it's the challenge of confronting, you know, so many crises at once in our country and trying to be an engaged activist with kind of the 401-year-old, you know, well past due kind of reckoning of racial injustice and structural inequality in our country, or the COVID pandemic crisis that we're living through, kind of the economic crisis we're living through. You know, what advice would you give someone to think about how can you be a good engaged citizen, like online or off or both, and kind of care for your mental health? And maybe, Steve, if you're comfortable, you could talk about how do you do that?
Well, I'm sure my family would give you a different version of how well I might do that, but it's a super critical piece of the puzzle, which is that, first of all, the level of stress and anxiety that, you know, the current environment today, even if you can find that optimism, which I have, that I describe in my book, it doesn't mean that you don't see the challenges every day. And so, you know, to answer the last part of the question you asked, Chelsea, is, I do find that, you know, it's a balancing act. You know, how do you stay engaged, but think, you know, try to take, you know, turn off the machines every so often, you know, get out, you know, go focus on other things. But those are too simple. I think, you know, when we get to real sort of mental health, I mean, those are mental health issues, but I also think we have a much bigger challenge right now, where we have actually an epidemic and with lack of attention to it in mental health. I mean, you can see, living in downtown Seattle, it's a crisis that we aren't coping with as well as we need to. So so there are some ideas. I mean, one is, I think it starts with the individual activist, and, you know, it's the, you know, what's the great line that is the revolution worth going through if you can't dance afterwards? I mean, I paraphrased it, but there is that, which is, like, you know, finding joy in a day-to-day context. And it's easier, you know, some people are handed such a lousy deck that's hard, but I think there is sort of that obligation, and that can be through a spiritual or a physical, or there's all sorts of ways that people find to do that. So I do think that's super important. I think we also have to take on a bigger set of challenges, which is that our fellow citizens and our communities need more, you know, support in this area. The globe has not paid very much attention to mental health as a serious health issue for years. And I write in the book, one chapter is about the exciting and actually powerful role of looking through activism through the lens of equity. And I speak a lot about gender equity, but it really is, the idea was generated really from a lot of different angles. Like, how do we actually start bringing the whole community along? And I do think there's a bit of an exciting trend that we're putting these issues on the table. There's a lot of new commitments. You've been a leader in this, Chelsea, around equity and inclusion, and I think mental health has to be a piece of that. And so I'm hoping that we'll be able to attend to that, both as individual activists, but also as whole communities.
Absolutely, and to support each other, like just on a fundamental level. I think, another kind of good question to move into now comes from Stacy, which is, Steve, regarding your discussion about community-centered reform, how do you see that playing out in hyper-local issues such as homelessness? Who is the customer in such challenges? And I would just also add, how do you think about balancing kind of the global and the local?
Yeah, well, thanks, Stacy. And the idea was derived in the book really from this idea that one of the other sort of macro trends or undercurrents is the idea that our communities around the world are becoming more and more empowered to set their own agendas. And that's actually both a global perspective and a domestic perspective. And so in the global health and development area, that's a very powerful undercurrent, that the countries and communities need to be more in charge of their destiny, and aid isn't about, going in and helping the victims, as we used to call them, but now empowering and being supportive of communities to make their own choices. And I see that's a super powerful trend in global health and development. I know Chelsea's been involved with this as well, and we've even talked about things like the decolonization of global health and development, which is the counter to that trend. Even domestically, we see, look at climate, where, there's been federal inaction. And so we've decided, local communities have taken a very powerful local stance on commitments to the Paris Accord or other commitments. And it even gets narrower and narrower as we look at the context around cities, problems in cities, or some problems in rural communities. I write about sort of the opioid addiction and how rural Montana has really been hit by it. And yet some of the best treatments are increasingly very locally derived, because they understand the nature of the community, the issues going on in that community. And so I find that those kinds of more hyper-local opportunities are powerful and could be really a really exciting trend moving forward. That we need to rethink of activism, so much less about imposing things from outside and more enabling communities to figure it out themselves. And so our role has to change in the way we engage, in the way we listen, and in the way we support each other. And so I'm excited about, communities are the customer for a practical activist, and that's kind of the way I think about it.
I totally agree. I think a good kind of next question, Steve, from your previous answer is from Jean, who asked, what is the role, if any, of simply donating money as a tool of practical activism? And I think that's an important question, whether we're kind of thinking about the local issues or the global ones.
Yeah, look, I can say this as a guy that spent most of the last many years of his life holding out tin cups. That we can't, we have to be realists too. I guess there's a bit of me. I'm kind of known in some of the circles I work in, not as the kind of the guy behind the scenes that finally brought in to kind of get things done. And in that practical practitioner role, I never ignore the role of money, which is necessary in always to make change happen. So I think it's a very powerful tool, and one that practical activists and others, we all need to figure out how we can provide resources. Sometimes it's not money or financial if you don't have the capacity, but time, resources, your other kinds of ways to contribute. And man, there's nothing wrong with just writing a big check or a small check, and I would never dismiss that. I do think that where and I raise this in the book, is I think that we also have to be careful that we don't, again, kind of going back to my earlier conversation about giving back, that we don't get caught up into this cycle that it's all about big ticket philanthropy, and that's where the action is. And I think I've talked about this with Bill and Melinda Gates, that that they are amazing in their work and what they've done with their resources, and yet they're the first to say they don't want to signal that people have to be wealthy to be actively engaged, or you don't have to write a big check to make a difference in the world. And I think we have to keep signaling that financial resources are necessary for activists and for people on the front line. I mean, I think, and Chelsea knows this super well, she's written about it, but people don't realize that much of Africa, for instance, where both of us have done a lot of work, the health workers are generally are volunteer, they're unpaid. There's a new kind of effort that's a big effort to say, can we actually move to a very nominally but nonetheless paid workforce to ensure that health, if we're going to actually provide universal health care, people have to get paid, and those kinds of things are going to be increasingly important.
Well, and that's also about gender equity, Steve, right? Since most volunteers are women. So yes, I could not agree more. I think we're going to go through two more questions kind of from the question box. One, I think is you can interpret however you would wish, Steve. It's from Roger, and Roger asks, what lessons can we learn from 2020? And I would say in the context of practical activism.
Yeah, I would say there are two that come to mind, just top of mind, and it's a super tough question because there's so many things that have happened this year that it's just sort of hard to imagine in some context. But one is leadership matters. I mean, throughout the world, I mean, I'm lucky to kind of see this crisis and this year through multiple angles, even though I'm sitting in the United States and sort of trapped here because we can't get out. The wall was effectively built around us. I do get the perspective globally every day, and leadership has really mattered, and that's not just national leadership, but local leadership, public health leadership, effective voices, so people can trust, the communities can trust them to do the right thing, and it is such a powerful lesson now because we've just seen how, I mean, the difference between both at the national level, but regionally, locally. I mean, the demographics of this pandemic in the United States, and if you look at it at a county or state level, it's a staggering political lesson. And so I think that matters. I also think the other one is that kind of the counter to that, and it's not counter, but it sort of sits alongside of it, is that everybody can do something. And, to your point earlier, Chelsea, there's been also just this amazing response by communities and by people of every ilk coming forward to, set up volunteers for kids that are able to go to school, to put their science to work on the next idea or app or drug, to, come up with ways to help people through the mental health stresses. I've seen so much goodness and so much innovation really coming through out of this, and I think that's an important lesson, and I hope we can hold that lesson tight because I think there's this sort of naive view that at some point we're going to be done with the pandemic and a vaccine will show up and then it's all over and we're all back to normal. And I don't think that'll happen. I'm positive and optimistic that the world will keep moving forward in positive ways, but we're going to have a lot of cleanup and things are going to look different in many places, and we'll have to cope with that. And I think that's true also around the election. if regardless of who wins, there's going to be a big chunk of the population that's still going to be unhappy, and we're going to have a lot of divisiveness. And so we're going to have to keep using every tool in our toolkit to keep addressing social change and supporting each other as activists.
I couldn't agree more. And Steve, since you mentioned the election, and I feel like I have to answer the first question that was submitted from Peg, and it was submitted to me. As someone who grew up in a political family, what experience do you think a candidate for the presidency should have? Well, I think as Steve said, we certainly have seen quite painfully this year that leadership matters. I think, though, it's really important that we not only think that leadership matters at the national level, as Steve also said, it really matters who's elected at every level, whether we're thinking about who is sitting on our local school board or in kind of the local city council seat that represents our neighborhood, kind of who is representing our family in the state legislature, kind of who is our state attorney general, kind of who's our governor, who's representing us in Congress and the Senate, and of course, kind of who's sitting in the White House. And I think we've certainly seen that kind of who runs for office matters. And I'm so thankful that we have had now in 2018 and 2020, kind of an unprecedented number of women running for office at every level, an unprecedented number of young people running for office at every level. And yet still overwhelmingly, it is older white men who run for office, and nothing against a white man that I admire greatly, Steve, but we need people kind of running for office who kind of look like our country and also have the diversity of experience that exists in our country. And I think to run for office, kind of a few things should be true. One, you certainly should believe in public service and both kind of the public and the service part of that, and that those two kind of must go together. And I think we are living kind of under an administration where there is no interest kind of in the public good or kind of in the service to ethos. So I think you have to believe in public service. You have to kind of believe that you are running to serve the public's interest. I think the second thing that has to be true is you have to have a clear vision of what you would do kind of in that office. If you really care about criminal justice reform, think about running for district attorney or attorney general or state legislature. If you really care about recycling programs, like run for the local sanitation board or the county commission or city council. You really care about foreign policy, like run for Congress, run for the Senate. You have to have a clear view of why you're running and what you want to do when you're in office. And I think to Peg's question, you also have to have then kind of a third point, the belief that you have the right mix of skills and experience to actually then be able to do the job that you hope to do. And I think you have to have mixed with that the real tenacity and the persistence to kind of just never give up and never forget kind of why you ran for office in the first place. And since you ask about kind of running for president, I think you should have had a public office before you run for president. I mean, we've had a number of presidents who've had very widely different experiences, some who kind of, I think, have done very good jobs in kind of helping expand the definition of we and we the people, as kind of RBG kind of famously said was what kind of motivated her kind of public service, albeit not in an elected office. We've had, I think, terrific presidents who've been governors, who've been mayors, who've been senators, who've been in Congress. But I do think it's important that you've held public office before. So I want to give the last word to Steve before we kind of hand it back to Town Hall. And I think, Steve, the last point I want to end on is sort of a personal question for me as a parent, but for anyone who has really young people in their lives, whether you're a parent, a grandparent, an older sibling, an aunt, an uncle, a mentor, a teacher, kind of what advice would you give on kind of raising good citizens and practical activists?
Well, I think that you've done such an amazing job already, Chelsea. Working, your books are so amazing. By the way, go buy her books too if you haven't. But as a way to communicate to kids the power of engagement. I think it's more about trying to develop service as a habit early on. And I don't mean, not to be obviously too rigorous about it, or, maybe some people do it like you have to do, I mean, we do that sort of the allowance, a little bit for you, a little bit to save, a little bit for your community, things like that. But also even with their time, like there's a bit of, and it can look as simple as going and pulling the neighbor's weeds, but that we're starting to set those habits early. I particularly feel that's true, particularly at young adults. So, because I think you get into sort of habits that you don't think about, how am I going to schedule my day or my time or my resources. And if you don't sort of start building those habits early, it's harder to do later in your life, honestly, until, so I think that would be one. It's just, that there's all these little ways that we've all probably taught, our parents taught us, or, we see in the community of just helping each other. And that I know that sounds a little kumbaya, but I think that's actually leads us to bigger social change. But in the end, just, find your passion and find your current. And that's what the book's about, is like, there's some pretty amazingly powerful currents out there. And there's some great examples of activists that have done some cool things, finding their currents, and they're global, and they're of all ages, and they're of all, types of backgrounds and experiences. And they, plugged in and are changing the world a little bit at a time. And to me, that's like the most important way to deal with our outrage, which is also in the title of the book, is to take our outrage and figure out how to channel it in a way that's meaningful, and hopefully will change the world a little bit. Thanks, Chelsea, so much. It's always such a pleasure to spend any time with you, and I'm such a big fan. So I'm really grateful to you and to your family.
Well, Steve, thank you so much. And I've just loved every second of our conversation, and thank you to Town Hall for having us this evening.
And on behalf of Town Hall, I want to thank both you, Chelsea and Steve, for being with us this evening. And I want to thank everybody else for tuning in. We really appreciate you spending your evening with us. If you enjoyed this event, you can find many more like it on our website, townhallseattle.org. We hope you'll consider making a donation, as your support will allow us to continue to provide events just like this one. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of Steve's book, Undercurrents, Channeling Outrage to Spark Practical Activism, please use the link on this live stream page to purchase through our friends at Elliott Bay Book Company. Finally, thank you again for being here. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.